Hi, George Hepworth, Grover Park Consulting. Let's build Mike's mobile library. In our final phase of the conversion from, or the migration from the original production version to a new development version where we can continue to explore ways to improve or modify or enhance our existing application, we're going to look at the final part where we are capturing images or pictures of the covers of our books that we put them in, as we put them into our library or into the catalog for our library, and then we store them in a location where they're available both to the PowerApps application on the browser and on the smartphone. As you can see, I picked Azure Blob Storage for that, and I'll explain to you what the options are and why I picked Azure Blob Storage. First, Azure Blob Storage is a cloud location where you have many different options for storing data. It's very good at the kind of data that we're talking about here, which are binary image files. The other two options that came to mind or come to mind as we talk about it are the attachment field in a SharePoint list. We can include attachments like an image in a record in a SharePoint list. I shy away from doing that. My experience in the Access world has not been real positive doing that. I don't know that they're any more efficient or effective in the SharePoint world, but I am leery of putting images, or rather binary files, in an attachment field in a table or a list. There's another problem with SharePoint lists. That is, well, not with SharePoint attachment fields, but with SharePoint library. SharePoint supports libraries, which are sort of similar concept to a network folder where you can just put all your images into the folder and link to them from your application. You can do that with a SharePoint library with all the images. The problem I ran into doing that was that although that is very fast and very efficient, those images were not showing up when I tried to run the PowerApps application on my smartphone. And I believe that has to do with the configuration of security across those two environments. And it just simply, I did not find a way to do it. I decided that rather than invest a whole lot more time trying to find a way to do it, I would go with the method that actually does work, which is very fast, which is very efficient, and which actually works to show those images in the smartphone environment as well. So, settled on Azure Blob Storage. Before we actually jump into showing you how this works, I'm going to stop the video and put it on pause. I want you to put your video on pause. What I need you to do is go create your own Azure Storage account. You can do that. You can set up a free trial with $200 credit to start. And I provided the link here, the URL, and I will copy that link into the comments for the video so you can go and find that service and sign up for it, because you'll need that to replicate the process of storing your images in cloud location. And I'm confident that the Azure Storage account is the most efficient way for our purposes here. There is a tool, actually it's called Storage Explorer, not Storage Container. That's an error in my slide. You can download and configure this free Azure Storage Explorer tool on your desktop, and that allows you then to directly with those images or other files really in your Azure Storage account independently of the PowerApps application itself. You can use it for, I've used it in the past, for example, as temporary backup. If I want to move say, a folder and into off the computer into a cloud location for a temporary storage location, and then bring it back later. You can do a lot of things with Azure Cloud Storage beyond what we're going to do in this video. But the most important thing you can do is stop this video and go watch this video. Shane Young is a PowerApps developer. He runs an organization called PowerApps 911, and he has done a lot of excellent videos on building little applications or large applications with PowerApps. But the one that is the most important to our purposes today is one on creating PowerApps Azure Blob Storage account and the connector. Rather than for me to repeat everything he did, and probably not as well as he did, I think you'll get the entire picture of what you need to do much better by simply investing 35 minutes in that video. He covers all of the details you'll need, including the credentials you'll need to secure it, and the keys you need to access it from PowerApps. And he walks you through that entire process. So again, rather than wasting your time having me do it in exactly the same thing, or maybe not even as well, I'll just ask you to go do that. So starting right now, let's put the video on pause, go watch Shane, go download and configure the free Azure Storage Explorer application, and sign up for your own Azure Storage account so you're ready to go. I'll see you when you get back. Well, if you're back, I assume that you have done two things to set up your account, and that you've invested some time, hopefully the entire 35 minutes, watching the Shane Young video. And now you know how to set up and use the Azure Storage account you just created, and how to use the Azure Storage Explorer tool that I described. I'm going to assume you have that all ready to go, and we'll dive right in to our implementation in the PowerApps for Mike's mobile library. Before I show you the actual app, I wanted to point out that this is my Azure Blob Storage account. You can see the pop-up identifies it as the Azure Blob Storage. Mike's library image is an alias that I assigned to the actual Blob storage itself in order to identify it in my PowerApps application. It has a different identity, but that seemed like a better alias to use. So just keep in mind that you can't go find Mike's library images on Azure Storage and get into my account, because that's not what it is. Okay, let's talk about how we're going to use this. Before we even get to that point, I need to show you a couple of things that I did in order to facilitate the way I wanted to use the Azure Blob Storage without having to remember all of the tedious details. As I just said, the Blob Storage identifier in my PowerApps application is itself an alias. And rather than remember all of the little details, there are keys, and if you've watched the other video and you've signed up for your Blob Storage account, you'll know that there are keys that are used to identify the library and individual files within those libraries. So what I did is in the onStart macro was create some variables. So rather than having to remember and use all of that technical stuff, I said I'm going to create public variables. I called them private variables, not because they're private in the same sense that a VBA module or variable would be private. They're private because they're my private variables, and I don't want to necessarily have you peeking at them while I'm showing you other things. So I hid them down here. The first one is this public URL. Now, as you can see, I've obscured most of it because I don't necessarily want you to be able to go and find it easily, although I don't think you could get to it without the key and the credentials anyway, but just to be safe. This is the public URL for my Blob storage account on Azure, and this is where I store and retrieve images for the albums. It has to be combined with other details in order to be used later in PowerApps. But again, rather than refer to this entire long URL, I simply said, let's call it cover Azure folder. And whenever I need to refer to it, I will just use that variable instead. The next one is the length. I need that length in various places, so I set a variable to the length of that folder, that URL, I should say, +1. Now, there's a reason for that. Mike's library images, as I said before, is the alias for the Blob storage account itself. And I created a variable called GPC Azure that goes to that Blob storage account and gets information that I need. This action here, list folder v2, gets a list of images currently available in a specific folder. And the key identifies the specific folder in my Azure Blob storage where my images are stored. So I can have multiple folders with different kinds of binary files. I can have my images in one, as I said earlier. I can have PDFs or ACCDB files, whatever I need to store up there. But the folder I want is identified by this particular key. And again, I blurred it out so that I don't inadvertently give people access to my Blob storage container by just revealing the key publicly. I don't think you could get to it anyway, but just to be on the safe side. So rather than, again, refer to this entire long string, simply call for the variable GPC Azure. And then the third variable that I set is a default image, and you can see that the ID for that image is itself quite long, again, blurred out here. But rather than have blank image controls or images, have a blank control show up on in record for an album, I said I will just display a default image so that there will always be something there, and you'll see the default that I picked, and this is the ID for it. So those are the three variables that I need to work effectively with, excuse me, those are the four variables I need to work effectively with my Azure Blob storage from within PowerApps. URL, the length of that URL +1, the list of the list of images in that folder generated by list folder v2. I store that into this variable, and then the default image that I'll use here and there. So with those three things in mind, let's look at how this works. And again, rather than drag you through the tedious process of copying and setting up the new screens, I simply went ahead and did it. Let's start with the Take Cover Photo screen. Okay, this part's going to be a little bit different because I have turned the camera over to the PowerApps application. I finally figured out, after how many videos I've made, that if I need to have the PowerApps have control of the camera, I have to turn it off for me. So that means you can't see my smiling face in the little image down in the lower right corner, but you can see me babbling away in the camera. The way this works is there's a control on this screen which is linked to the camera, as you obviously can see. There are controls on here to take a picture of whatever is the camera has in front of it at that moment. I'll go ahead and hold up a book. Now, if I were doing this with the phone, of course, I would get a lot better pictures because the phone works a lot better. The camera in the phone works a lot better. But I'll go ahead and snap the cover picture. That puts it into a preview. And if I like it, and I'm not going to keep this one, I'm going to replace it with one from the camera, but I'll say that's good. I can see the author and the title of the book, and I will call it The Road. And then I will save this to the image library. When I click this icon, or this button, which has an icon on it, it will run the code in the SharePoint flow, which takes this image and pushes it into my Azure Blob storage account. It should go fairly quickly. And it is moving the image up there, but it's also rebuilding an internal collection of images that I need. So it took a little longer. Now I can actually go ahead and open that in the browser, and then you can see in my browser, this is looking at my storage account, my Blob storage account, and it's found that particular image. You can see that then I have an image that I can now attach to a book. Let's pause and look at how all this works. Okay, then I gave control back to the video recording software. You can see my camera in the PowerApps is no longer active, but we already have captured this one image, and we could go ahead and work with it. Let's start with the camera control. Now, again, if you watch the Shane Young video, and I really hope you have, this will all be familiar, and I will not waste a lot of your time going through it again. We can pick the camera to use. Sorry about that. Let me get this clear. So this is a camera control, and you insert that from the media element on the ribbon. It is set to use camera number 1, which is not a real camera, actually. Well, it's an internal camera that's not functioning. Camera 0 is the webcam. If I set it back to 0, now that I'm recording it, it won't work either, but it's now set to 1, so it doesn't interfere with the video recording software. Let's look at a couple of other properties. The on select, there are no events on select because we're not doing anything with it directly. And the on stream is false, and the stream rate is set to 100. And these are all coming from Shane's video. Snap cover. Let's look at the on select property for it. The on select event for this button updates updates the context for this variable. In other words, it takes this variable called var_covPic and adds to it the stream of data coming from our camera control. We set that to a stream rate of 100 based on Shane's video, which says that's the optimum rate for capturing images. So it's looking at the camera preview control. It's looking at the stream coming from that control, which is a record type. And it's updating the value of this coverPic variable to the stream or the image coming from that camera control. So now there's an image stream, or an image stored in var_covPic. This image control, and you can see that it is an image control, has as its image var covpic. So in what we have done is taken that image, turned it into a variable called coverpic, and assigned this image control to display that image. We have to give it a title in order to save it to our library in Azure storage. So we use a text input box. It does not have any events associated with it, or it doesn't have any actions associated with it. False, because all we're doing is entering a string of text that we're going to use as the name of that image when we store it. Clear preview, I'll take a quick look at that. It's simply a way to drop the image we just selected. If we take that same variable, var covpic, which is the cover picture, and set it to a blank record instead of the stream that came from the camera control, it blanks it out and it effectively removes it. Let's look at this one because it's more interesting. The onSelect of this particular set of controls is a little more interesting, and I'm going to come back here. I select this so you can see. Actually, this is a group, and I have not really talked about grouping controls. It's something that is pretty handy. What I did was I took the icon and the button and combined them into a group so that they act together as one object. That way I've got a picture and text on the same object, which acts as a unit. It's a group. So the onSelect applies to both of them. Here's how it works. If I've added, or the user has added anything into the input box, if the length of the text that's typed in there is 0, then they have not done that yet. And what we have to do is tell them, hey, I can't save this until you give me a name. Make sure you use the PNG file type. This is the default file type that everybody here is expecting to see. SharePoint expects it. PowerApps, everybody wants to see PNG. You can change it to other file types, but that's sort of the default, and I decided I'll just go with the flow and use the PNG type. If there is a value, if the length of that text is greater than 0, then we assign this text or string variable the name of the photo or the image taken from that input box and append to it or concatenate to it the PNG file type. So the result then is a file name in the appropriate format, name.extension. Okay, this next part is a little bit tricky. Originally when I recorded this, I got it wrong. Mike's library images, which is the connector to Azure, exposes certain properties, one of which is create file. What we do is we take the photo name that we just created here, the image stream that came from our camera image, and we create a file in Mike's library using this file and the name that we just assigned to that file. Mike's library, in quotes, identifies the container in my Azure Blob storage account where it will be saved. Now, this private variable below, I think I misspoke earlier when I said we're updating a collection. What we're actually doing is updating this variable. And the variable that we're updating is that list of files from the Blob storage folder. As you remember, I said that folder v2, list folder v2, retrieves a list of all of the available files. And we put it into that variable var gpc Azure. That list in that variable at this point does not yet contain this new image that we just added. So what we're doing down below is just renewing that same variable, but this time when we pull the list, it will include the one we just added. And so our variable list, that var GPC Azure, will now include that newest image. There is another image control here. It's very much like this one. I'll show you that when we get to that point of the workflow. I've hidden it for now because I did not want to confuse the user by having two buttons that do similar but different things. We got here by coming straight from the menu where we wanted to just take a cover photo. We're not assigning it yet to any particular book. The code behind this one does one very simple task. It launches in the web browser. Now the PowerApps command launch sends me to this URL, and if you recall, I said we're going to save the HTTP URL for our Azure Blob storage folder in this variable, so I don't have to remember to type it all out and get it right every time. And we're going to concatenate with that the name of the photo that we just stored as an image up there. I ended up using trim to make sure that there were no extraneous trailing or leading spaces or characters in that name that would trip it up in the Azure storage environment. And what that does, again, is launch the browser and show the image. So that's all that's happening here. I think what I'm going to do is show you the next step in a separate video. We're already pushing 30 minutes, which is way longer than I would have liked. And in order to do this in a manner that's going to be a little bit more practical for you and for me, frankly, I'm going to call it quits now. I'll come back in the next video. We'll follow the other branch where instead of simply saving a video, we'll go back to publications. Oh boy, we're going really slow because we've got the video recording running as well, and that always slows me down. Let's find one that I don't have an image stored for yet. I think all of these that I have now have images. But you know, everything here has an image. So let's just take this one. We'll look. On the edit screen now, I have added these controls from production. These weren't here in the last time you saw this screen. We can take a cover photo. If we go from this point, from this entry point, rather than from the menu, this entry point takes us to the same screen. But this time, because we have previously identified the publication that we're going to link that to, we have this button is now lit up and it is active, and it will do two things. It will save the image to the library. Take the image, give it a name, save it to the library. But it will also then go back and create a link between this image and its publication. Let's go back and do that in our next video. As I say, I am a little uncomfortable about how long we've gone, so I'm going to call it quits for today, give you a chance to take a break. Rewatch Shane Young's video if you don't mind, if you have any lingering questions. You've seen it in action in our app, PowerApps. You might want to go back and look and see some of the things that he did and how it applies to what we're doing here. I hope you have found something useful here today. If you have, smash that like button. Subscribe to my channel so I have an incentive to keep making these videos for you. And I will see you next time out. Thank you.